welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to do a book review, a book that I've just read called Coming Up for Air by George Orwell, who we all probably know. He's quite a famous author.
I think we've all heard of 1984.
Yeah, have you read George Orwell?
Yes, we had 1984 at school, not as part of the historic curriculum, thank you very much. We read it as English literature, and we also read Animal Farm.
At school?
At school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, part of our English literature sessions. It was really interesting because otherwise we had Shakespeare or Dickens. So
did you not do Shakespeare at school?
Yeah.
Well, no, you didn't do
we
Shakespeare.
We were forced to do Shakespeare.
Yeah, I was going to say we did Shakespeare.
Shakespeare every term.
That's interesting, 1984 at school, because actually I think 1984 is quite an advanced one.
It is. It's quite... I think we more looked at it in terms of what might happen in the future as a kind of...
Well, at school they don't do nightmares.
And I'd also heard people talk about Room 101 and about rats in a helmet going around, and I thought, what's going on? So,
yeah, because Room 101 was a programme in the 90s, wasn't it? Where celebrities went on and picked the things that they disliked to put into Room 101. And then obviously there was the concept of Big Brother, that television show, which came from 1984. Which is interesting, because I read 1984, but not until I was an adult, and it's still one of my absolute favourite books.
Yeah.
Animal Farm I never liked so much because we did it at school. Well, actually, I don't remember reading it at school. You know what I remember? When I was 14 and we did GCSE drama, they took us to the local arts centre to watch a one-man play of Animal Farm. And it was literally a man in a jumpsuit with a crate. That was the only prop. One man in just a plain jumpsuit and a crate. And he acted out...
Or was it?
And he acted out over 2 hours all of Animal Farm. And we were 14. And we were like children that hadn't really been, you know, we were all from working class. We were all from working class families. We were at a state school, and it was so boring, and that really put me off. Not 1984, Animal Farm. Sorry, yeah. It was just like this man prancing around like a horse for 2 hours, and then a pig, and
why?
With a crate in this
torture you
jumpsuit.
with that?
I don't know. I'm sure, like, if you saw it as an adult, I'm sure it was probably a really sensitive, deep, artistic, meaningful interpretation of something. But
not for children.
No, on a bunch of 14-year-olds who were doing drama and perhaps going to the theatre for the first time. Yeah, it was completely lost.
Be my fun.
So that always put me off Animal Farm.
I can understand.
But then, because I was in my 20s when I read 1984, I really loved that book, and still one of my favourites. And 1984 was actually written in 1949, just a year before George Orwell's death.
Interesting.
Animal Farm was written in 1945, and this book, Coming Up for Air, was written between 1938 and 1939, and was actually published for the first time in 1939. And interestingly, it was published and printed a few copies and distributed, but then the Second World War actually interrupted the printing and distribution of the book, and it wasn't more widely distributed again until after the war. And it's interesting because there are some parts of this book that are very much like remind me of 1984. So let me start. So the book's in 4 parts, and it's written in the first person perspective of a character called Tom, and he's born in 1893. So in the point where the book's set, he's 45. What year does it make it in the story?
You're going to ask me to do complicated maths now, aren't you? I'm running out of fingers. 33, 38. It's 1938.
Yeah, 38. So it's set.
So it's set contemporaneously.
Yeah, when George Orwell's writing the book, it's set. And the interesting thing about Tom is he's kind of a average middle-aged man. He's got false teeth, which he mentions so much in the story, and I find that quite interesting because
why?
He's obsessed with the false teeth because of the way he talks a lot about his appearance. But it's just interesting because I don't know, I don't think that's quite common for people of 45 to have false teeth. Well, not nowadays. I mean, even old people don't tend to have false teeth these days.
Don't look at me when you say that. But it's true, because both my parents, certainly by the time I remember them, they both had false teeth. Not complete sets. My dad had one denture he'd pop out and terrify his grandchildren or make them scream with laughter. And my mum had more false teeth. She had more dodgy teeth. But yeah, you don't seem to see that so much now.
No, and I suppose your parents were born, well, maybe 30 years later than this character. Yeah, so it's interesting. I just wonder if dentistry has improved so much now.
I think it has, because I have vague memories of my grandmother saying that she when she was in her 20s, went to the dentist to have all her teeth out so she could have false teeth to avoid having problems. Whereas now on the NHS, if you go, it's absolutely obsessed with preserving your teeth at all costs. So
yeah, because I think I'd be quite horrified of the thought that in sort of 8 or 9 years I might need false teeth.
Yeah, ditto.
But anyway, it's quite interesting just to observe the way that sort of things have changed in dentistry. So he's got false teeth. He always describes himself as quite fat and pudgy and red-faced, and he works in the insurance business, which is quite interesting. So he's quite middle class, I guess, for the time, what we'd consider middle class now, because he works in insurance. And he's got a wife called Hilda, who's always worried about money, and 2 children. So the thing about this book, so it's in 4 parts, and the first part is him describing what his life is like now. And I'd say the book is really gloomy and grim. Actually, it's definitely not a good book if you're, you want something jolly and uplifting. It's not jolly and uplifting at all. It starts on him sort of describing his life now, and his sort of family situation, his sort of domestic life, and he also mentions in the first part that he's just won a little bit of money gambling that he doesn't want to tell his wife about. But what I find really interesting, there's so much of this book actually that I really reflect. It's like it could be written now, 100 years later. If you made the sort of settings slightly more contemporary, there's so many things that resonate with us right now.
Yeah.
It's like, to quote Shirley Bassey, it's all just a little bit of history repeating. But it's true, because it's interesting when he sort of talks about the fact that all of the people in his area. So he lives somewhere called Ellesmere Road. It's kind of like on the outskirts of London. He commutes into London. And he talks a lot about owning houses, because he owns his own house. But he talks about the fact that people don't ever really own their own houses, because they're just leasing them.
Owns,
Exactly. And he also reflects on the fact that people are very trapped in this lifestyle, because your boss constantly has this thing over you, because if you lose your job, you'll lose your house. So there's kind of like that constant fear of losing your home, which I'm sure a lot of people feel, particularly nowadays with the cost of living crisis. It's so relatable.
More now than even a couple of years ago. Even at the height of the pandemic, I think the fear was different. But I think now, with the cost of living increase, as you said, it feels much more that people are on the edge, 2 or 3 salary checks away from...
I mean, in some ways things have changed, because there's a moment in sort of towards the end of the first part when he goes into, I think it's like a kind of pharmacy or whatever the equivalent is in those days, to buy a razor blade, and he sees the manager of the store treating the young girl serving behind the counter really appallingly, being very rude to her, telling her off about something. And he sort of, reflects on how that girl's just got to take that, because she's got no choice. If she wants that job, that's just the way it is. So hopefully in some ways things have changed, because now I think you've got so many more protections at work that mean that we have to treat each other with respect and dignity, and your manager they can ask you to do something, but they have to treat you in a nice way. And
so long as you're employed in a decent employer who fulfills all those criteria, because if you're working for cash in hand or 0 hours contract, I think it's very easy to speak from a sort of personal experience where we're lucky enough to be in that situation. But I know, chatting to colleagues who experience 0 hours contracts, the insecurity and the fear, because that's not so much about being treated badly necessarily, it's about not having any work at all.
No, actually,
but does it give you more rights?
Yeah, that's a very good point, because you're right, particularly being like employed in the kind of education sector. Yeah, you do have like this, and especially as we see now, people who are employed in industries where they are part of unions, and unions protect them and protect their rights. So it's kind of an interesting reflection on that's perhaps how something in some ways for many people has changed for the better, but maybe not all people. You're exactly right. The other thing that I found was really interesting is he talks about getting on the train, and 2 men refer to him as Tubby. And comment on his weight, because he himself reflects often in the book how he's overweight, and that interests me, because he actually points out at the time that weight is the one thing that he believes it's still socially acceptable to comment on.
Interesting.
So there's other things that perhaps even he's thinking, and now in 1939 are not acceptable. So they've obviously moved forward in a way, but weight is still something that is acceptable to comment on.
So physical disability would be something you wouldn't, or physical difference.
Yeah,
you
that's what
wouldn't
he
comment on that.
talks about, which is interesting because actually sometimes we do think 100 years ago, like, yeah, you could say anything.
Anything you wanted to about anyone you wanted to.
And that was acceptable and seen as okay at the time. So that's interesting, and I wonder, see, in some ways I think that's changed, but then I wonder, has it?
I have this theory that what people think, and it's not the new theory by any way, is that what people think hasn't altered, but what people verbalise has.
Yeah, because I think if I was sat on a train on my way to work, commuting into London, as this character does, and, I don't know, somebody referred to another passenger as Tubby, because I think they're asking him for a match, and they said, oh, have you got a match, Tubby?
Yeah.
I don't know, I hope, I don't know if I would say something. I don't know. I mean, maybe I would
Probably we wouldn't, because
I probably
you don't
wouldn't think
want to
it's
get
any of my
involved.
business, but I would think that was very, very rude.
Yeah.
Whereas the train he's on, none of the other passengers seem to feel that that's rude. They seem to feel that's fair game to mention somebody's weight. But I would personally find that, and hopefully most people around me would also find that that's something that's very personal, and you shouldn't comment on that. Mention somebody's weight in a derogatory way is rude. So. He also talks about the newspapers in the first part, and that they've got like a fascination with kind of horror and gory stories. That he picks up a newspaper and like legs is the headline, and it's because they found legs of a corpse somewhere.
Yeah.
So in some ways it's interesting because I think why he's discussing the newspapers is because it's obviously the build-up towards the Second World War, which is really interesting in this book because obviously when Orwell is writing this book, the Second World War still hasn't actually happened. Yeah. So what Orwell's writing is actually what's happening at the time. So this character, this reflection and this feeling is war coming. And I think that's the problem is for the character, because the media is very dramatic.
Yeah.
He's often wondering with these stories, is it really coming? Is it not coming? Is it just all sort of hype?
Yeah, exactly.
Because he's constantly reflecting and feeling that war is around the corner, and then some days he's saying, yeah, it's all been dramatised. Is this actually going to happen? And there's an interesting point at the end of the first part where he sees a poster with a name on it. I can't remember. I think a name of some African king. And it actually reminds him suddenly of something in church. I can't remember why. And then part two, then he goes back to his childhood, and he sort of goes back in time and starts a new narrative about his childhood before the Boer War. So what year was the Boer War? I don't know.
1890 something. That's very helpful because you told me he was born in 1893.
Oh yeah,
1900s.
So he talks about growing up, and he grows up in this place called Upper Binfield in Oxfordshire, and he goes back to his very early childhood and talks about all of his memories before the Boer War. Also the way people's political views changed during the Boer War. People become very patriotic suddenly, and they distrust foreigners. He says before the Boer War, the area where he lived was very liberal, and many of his family members were liberal, and straight away after the war everybody votes Conservative. But by 1906 he comments that actually people have really forgotten that time and are liberal again. So his father works in a shop, and his mother most of his memories of his mother is just cooking in the house. And he talks about his parents actually as being, I think he describes his mother as unbelievably ignorant. She doesn't even know where Ireland is or who the Prime Minister is. And she doesn't want to know, which is quite interesting.
That's interesting because I'm all fired up to go, how could he say this? But she doesn't want to know. I wonder why not. None of her business. Maybe it's as simple as that.
So I suppose his parents in this story would have been the same sort of age as your grandparents.
Yeah.
Were your grandparents? I don't suppose though by the time you knew them.
Yeah, it's.
Because I suppose this is the problem as well. Because when you think about it, at this time, all people had were newspapers.
Yep.
You know, they didn't have the internet or any other way of finding out any information.
She had newsreels, I think, but you had to go to the cinema to see them, so you had to make the effort. And I suppose...
And I suppose that's the thing, is this is actually described as a kind of country town. There isn't a cinema.
Yeah.
Could
she even read, I wonder?
I think he does talk about her reading later, because it's interesting because he talks a lot about, like, you know, insects in the house and the sounds of flies, and, you know, that's actually quite a nice childhood memory for him as opposed to the sound of the bombers that he hears now. So he's quite intelligent, and he goes to a grammar school, and he reflects on his kind of obsession. He loved fishing. And he always wanted to go fishing. And eventually one day he ditches school and actually does go fishing with some friends. What really occurred to me is how violent some of this story is as well.
Yeah.
The way that the children, like as boys, they act. I was a bit shocked actually. Maybe that's my delicate sensitivities. But he talks about...
Snowflake.
He talks about sneaking off with his friends, and they find like chicks in the woods, and they just stamp on them and kill them.
Yeah.
Like, you know, they just think that's just the way boys are and just what boys do, and they blow up frogs.
Yeah.
And do other things that, I don't know, I just find personally quite violent.
It's
I'm not
gross,
sure I would have done that as a child. Is that our
No.
sensitivities have changed, or our...
I wonder if it's to do with living in the country, because although my dad was brought up by his grandmother, and some of the things he described that he did were pretty gross. I mean, he would have been, what, in the late 30s? Well, yeah, early to late 30s he would have been being brought up in the countryside. So a similar, maybe 20 years before. So
That's interesting.
yeah,
I don't know.
you do wonder though, because it's like Lord of the Flies. You read that, and the level of violence that people can get to, children, really quickly, who we like to think of as these sweet innocent little things who would never do anything. I think if they had to, they survive. So
he gets really obsessed with fishing and goes off fishing as a boy in every opportunity he can.
yeah,
And then one day there's this place called Binfield House in the town.
yeah,
And he finds there's a pond where somebody gives him permission to go fishing, but he actually finds when he goes further back through like the brambles and bushes, there's a secret pond with these enormous carp.
Oh, wow.
And he doesn't have a rod and a line strong enough to handle these carp, so he always vows that he'll go back to this pond. But then he never does. So he never fishes again, actually, from the age of 16. There's a time during World War One when a soldier tells him about ponds and they think they're going to go fishing, and then they actually get sent down the line the next day, so they never get the chance.
So sent down the line is to go to the front to fight.
I think so, yeah. And then there's another time, actually, when he goes back to the future with his wife and
in
children.
His storytelling.
In his storytelling, and, you know, back when he's 45, when they're on a family holiday in Bournemouth, and he sees a man catching a fish and mentions to his wife that he wants to fish.
Yeah.
And who completely disapproves and says, no, you can't do that because of the cost and everything. So he actually goes to a grammar school, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
He's quite a big reader, and he finds that this is a way that he can educate himself and maybe get out of the story. So, but when he's 16, suddenly his father is getting competition from a big firm, because his father owns this grocery shop.
Yeah.
And suddenly a big firm opens that's like a kind of chain and is putting pressure on this small family business. So when he's 16, suddenly his father says to him, you're going to need to leave school and work. And his brother, he's actually got a brother called Joe that he discusses, who's also told he'll need to contribute and work, who actually eventually runs away to America, and you never hear about him again. But it's, you know, and again, this is what really interested me about this story. And, you know, sometimes we complain now about, oh, my working week and I'm working so long.
Oh, don't we just? Yes.
So he's sent out to work, and his father fixes him to get a job at a grocery shop, and he works there for 6 years, and he actually quite likes this job at the grocery shop. But you know, his working hours are 11 hours a day, except on a Thursday and a Sunday.
That is
Shocking.
a long time.
11 hours a day. Well, I mean, maybe we are all,
Maybe maybe
soft
that's
now.
where legislation improving working hours has helped.
Yeah.
So.
Because that kind of shocked me when I read that, and
Especially at 16, because you'd think younger workers would have protection from having to work for such long hours.
But it's also the fact that his impression in this book as well is that actually he's really lucky to have gotten this good job,
and it's quite reasonable.
And it's reasonable, and it's nice conditions, and the
Yeah.
shop owner's really, you know, decent to him and treats him well, and he's earning, you know, again what we would consider pittance now, but actually good money for him. So yeah,
it just make you realise.
It really, really does put it in perspective. And yeah, like I said, suddenly his brother steals money from his mum and dad and runs away, and they never see him again. During the time when he's working in this grocery as well, he gets involved with a girl for the first time. He talks a bit about that. That's not really an integral part of the story. But he also talks about, you know, the continuous worry of people in those days, like his parents, of going bankrupt and ending up in a workhouse.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting thing, because even actually when he's back in his contemporary life, this is one of his wife's big worries, is that they'll go bankrupt and end up in a workhouse. I mean, we don't even have that now. You just go on to benefits, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and you still end up being very hungry and starving and cold.
You have
but
to
you
go to
don't.
a food bank, but you wouldn't end up in a workhouse being
No.
worked to death, would you? And I think as well, he reflects that in those days, that was a lot of old people's worries, that
It
as they
was
get older
huge.
and they stop being able to work or run their businesses, that they'd end up in a workhouse and end their days there.
There was a huge social stigma as well, because your family was supposed to look after you, and if they couldn't, you'd go to the workhouse, or if you drank or you gambled or you just wasted your money, you could end up there. And in fact, you go there through no fault of your own.
Yeah.
Economic circumstances and hardships. Like people on benefits today, it's often no fault of their own.
So that's quite interesting, because that's something that sort of runs through that theme of constant worry about money and ends up in this workhouse. Something interesting he talks about is then his life in that place is disruptive when the First World War breaks out. He reflects how people are really happy when the First World War breaks out. He said people cheered when the First World War breaks out.
They did. It'll be over by Christmas.
Yeah. And he says 2 months later he was in the army, and 7 months later he was in France.
Yeah.
And then he's actually wounded in 1916, and he's sent, after he goes to hospital, and after he's in hospital, he's actually sent to an officers' training school.
Oh.
And this is where he is then able to elevate himself.
Oh, so he makes the jump then?
From the social class that he was born into to where he then ends up after the war as the kind of businessman.
Interesting.
Because he's sent to an officers' training school. He then finds out his father's died, his mother's died. He goes back to the village where he was born to go to the funerals, but I don't think he's actually very moved by that time. I think he's quite, because he listed, literally in this chapter lists everybody that's died in the war, and I think he's become a bit kind of cold and hardened to the death of even of his parents. Oh yeah, and it's interesting, when he goes back for his mother's funeral, he reflects how all the horses are gone from the village, suddenly. Yeah. So it's not only the fact that all the boys are gone, and
the animals, the horses.
Yeah, the horses, the animals, everything's gone for the war, and that's what really strikes him. He ends up being sent to some office after he's been to the officers' training school, because they realise that he had been a grocer's assistant before, and he's posted down in the southwest to look after rations.
Of course, yes, his previous experience would have...
Yeah, because of being a grocer's assistant. This is interesting. So he meets somebody who... some sort of sir or very important person who decides, because of he's now an officer and because of his previous experience as a grocer's assistant, he can go down southwest to look after rations, which ends up actually not being there. But it's interesting because he then talks about getting a salary or whatever to stay there for the rest of the war. And nobody ever realises that there's no rations there. He just sends a report back or fills in a form every month or something. And nobody ever, and he always puts honestly that there's nothing there, but nobody ever questions it. And he just stays there and spends the rest of the war reading and improving his mind. But he does talk about how the war changes people's perspectives and also starts them questioning things.
Have you got any examples? Because that sounds really interesting to me. Because what you were saying, whilst you're thinking, what you were saying about people welcoming the outbreak of war, going back to when I was younger, when the Falklands War broke out, and I'm not going into the politics of it at all, but there were people cheering and shouting and celebrating the fact that our boys were going off. And it was quite... you wondered, I must admit I wondered, is this what it was like in the Second World War? Was it like that in the First World War? My feeling was, based on anecdotes from talking to people who'd been in both, I think it was the First World War that was like that, not the Second. I think the Second was more, we really don't want to, but we're going to have to. And I apologise for being politically naive. That's thinking about recollection, not historical accuracy.
I think the reason why people, why he says it got people questioning things was because they were promised that after the war life was going to be better.
Fit for heroes,
Exactly, and that they were going to be very wealthy and affluent, and then suddenly after the war people were very disillusioned because they came back and they couldn't get jobs.
Yeah,
they were still rationing for many years, they were kind of left. This quote actually, so he says, all the while there'd been an idea floating around, and this applied to the men in the ranks as well as the officers, that when we came out of the army there'd be jobs waiting for us, and that would bring in at least as much as our army pay. Of course, if ideas like that didn't circulate, no war would ever be fought.
Precisely. You're fed the idea, given the impression that things will be better.
Yeah.
Not go back to what they were, but better.
Exactly. And that's a point that, who would fight the war so enthusiastically if they didn't think that things were going to be better afterwards. Yeah. So that's interesting. So, so what happens though for him is he is actually quite fortunate because he talks about lots of different jobs where he wants to become a salesman, and he actually randomly bumps into, that's it, Sir Joseph, who got him the job in looking after the rations in the southwest during the war. He randomly bumps into him, who fixes him up a job in insurance. And then that's
because I wondered how he'd gone from being a grocer's assistant.
Yeah.
Because I could see how his family go down the social scale as then you would do if you had your own shop and then you stop having it and you end up with money worries, etc. I can see how you'd go down, how you'd have to go out to work. But I wondered how he got from one place as a grocer's assistant to an officer.
And then, through this guy that he met and had arranged for him to go down there to do the rations during the war, he then randomly bumps into him and says to him, I really need a job, and he's lucky that he gets fixed up with one in insurance. Because he says, I'd like to work in sales or something. And the guy's like, well, what about insurance? And he's like, perfect.
That'll do nicely.
And then he gets married. So he meets his wife, Hilda, when he's living in a boarding house in Ealing. So he meets Hilda at tennis club, and Hilda's family is a higher class than his. So her family have got lots of imperial roots in India.
Frightfully.
In India.
Mulligatawny.
And he doesn't really know why he marries her, because he doesn't actually really like her, and he doesn't enjoy being married to her. But
so does she manoeuvre him into marrying him, or does it just happen?
It just seems to happen. I'm not sure how, but I think also because he's quite taken with the fact that her family is so middle class.
Oh, so he likes the idea
kind of
the
higher
social
class. Yeah, so it's socially elevating him by marrying her, because all of her family have been in India in these imperial roles, and he talks about going to their house and all of this like tigers' heads and all this. You can imagine this kind
and
of
all that kind of gross stuff. Yeah.
So the next part of the book, the third part of the book, is back in the present day, and he talks about going to a lecture with Hilda about called The Menace of Fascism. And what's really interesting is that he goes to this lecture. He's not really interested. Hilda and her friends are interested. Because they feel like they're expanding their minds, these women who obviously have nothing to do because they have no jobs or anything in those days, but they want to think that they're expanding their minds, and they go to these lectures and he feels that it all washes over them. They're there more
to be seen.
And what strikes him in this lecture is that all the young lads there get very excited about the thought of a war.
Yeah, very passionate, very let's defend freedom. That sort of
the way that he got excited about the war before the First World War, the way people cheered then, and that the young lads are actually quite shocked when they finally, because he doesn't give an opinion until invited to by these young lads, and he just sort of says to them, we don't want war, war's terrible, and tells them some of the awful things he saw, but that doesn't change the young lads' minds. They're
still be different.
Yeah, because he talks about the idea that some of the guys in the audience are like communists. But he also reflects that if the fascists come to England, it won't make much difference to guys like him. That's how he feels.
That's very interesting, because there was so much appeasement, ignorance, sweep it under the carpet, hope it won't happen, or, just let's fight another war. It's not worth the pain and the anguish and the death.
The next scene is when he drives into the country. He's on his way back from a job or somewhere, and he suddenly gets this idea about going back to Binfield, where he grew up. And he's like, this is when the coming up for air, he describes the idea of going back there, going to this lovely country village, just for a break. And he also even imagines going back to that pond where he never caught the big carp and actually fishing again.
Unfinished business and trying to
so he becomes quite obsessed with this idea about going back to the place where he grew up just for a holiday on his own, and he's not going to tell his wife where he's going, so he tells her he's going to go to Birmingham on a business trip, so he heads towards Oxford. So that part 3 is quite short really, and then part 4 is where he actually does go back to Binfield where he grew up. But as he approaches it, it's now become a manufacturing town. And the population, which was around 2,000 when he grew up, is now about 25,000.
That's going to have made a lot of difference.
Yeah, and he says now there's houses, there's shops, there's cinemas, there's football grounds, there's loads and loads of things. And he feels like almost an enemy invasion has already happened of that place.
That's a really interesting way to think about it as well.
It is. And then he's also really disappointed because when he goes into a hotel and says his name, he expects his name is going to be recognised because his family was from that area and that everybody, would have known everybody in those days. But nobody recognises his name. He's just like another person there. And he goes back to his father's old shop where he grew up. And it's now a tea room. And he goes to the graveyard and sees all the graves of the people he used to know.
So it's not coming up for air at all, it's being...
Yeah, exactly. And what interests him is actually that there's lots of planes going overhead, lots of bombers and things, particularly there, which he doesn't expect to see so much outside of London. But actually finds out from the barmaid
Yeah.
of the pub in the hotel where he's staying that actually bomb the factories in his town are making bombs for the war now. And it's just like it's a really
it sounds
grim,
really, really grim because he tries to
sort of a feeling.
He goes through his childhood. He revisits his childhood. It sparks memories in that he thinks he'd like to go back and revisit. Tries to revisit. That's been invaded. He feels like a fascist invasion wouldn't make much difference to people like him anyway. Surprisingly, he thinks life is, and I'm not being frivolous, he thinks life is worth living at all because everywhere has changed.
It's true, and I mean, even like I think he feels like he's going to escape back to some lovely past romantic where he grew up, and it doesn't exist because he even talks about, after breakfast. He leaves the hotel and sees children with like gas masks on, and they're doing like an air raid practice or something. And he just talks about wandering around for days. Nobody recognised him, and he feels like a kind of ghost. So the girl Elsie, who he dated when he was in the grocer's shop, I think I mentioned briefly earlier on, he suddenly spots her. And this is interesting because again, this is the time the book was written. I mean, I don't know because I tend to read books that are older than this.
Yeah. And I tend to read much more contemporary ones.
So maybe you'll tell me if this... So I'm quite shocked by some of the descriptions in the books because I find them quite rude. But then it's because, in a lot of older books they can't even tell you anything. And
they can't mention the word leg.
Or even when they talk about women sort of not being virgins and they never actually say that. They just talk about fallen women or something. And you've got to...
Or no longer chaste.
Yeah, and you've got to kind of fill in the gaps yourself of what that means. But anyway, so he spots Elsie, who he used to date. And she's now 47, and she's ugly and she's old. And he actually follows her.
Old at 47? Outrageous.
Well, that's how he describes her, as ugly and old. And he sort of talks about, like he says, it's a cold, deadly, desolate feeling when he sees her. She was a beautiful girl that he'd had his first time with, and now she's this ugly old sort of woman that he follows back to a shop where she's a shopkeeper's wife.
Yeah.
Which I guess is similar to the class where he came from.
I suppose yes, it is. I wouldn't be happy to be described like that. And of course it's completely inaccurate, on the age at least. So, but I think the thing is, it's like the death of your dream. So the language you use is going to be harsher and more desolate because that's the last little piece of his dream that was alive and it's just been snuffed out.
You say that, but that's the last little piece of his dream. And I mean, also, Elsie obviously didn't have all the asp milk that you lather yourself in these days to keep yourself beautiful for longer.
And it works, doesn't it, darling?
Of course.
Yes.
Okay, so that wasn't the last bit of his dream, seeing that his sort of his teenage fling. Well, so then he goes back to Binfield House, where he had seen that big carp pond, and he wants to know if it's still there. And Binfield House has actually been turned into a mental health facility. The big pool, the main pool that wasn't secret, now has been turned into a model yacht club. And there's millions of children, well not millions, loads and loads of people sailing boats on it, and it's not peaceful and solitary.
Loud, noisy.
And he meets somebody really eccentric and starts a conversation, and then ends up asking this man, there used to be a bigger pool behind this one that was all further back and hidden away. And then he finds out that actually the big pool where he'd seen these carp that he'd always dreamed about going back and fishing for has now actually been drained and turned into a rubbish dump.
That just kind of sums up his life experience, really.
Well, that's it. And he says, coming up for air, but there isn't any air.
Yeah, there's no air. You're just going to be choked to death. By your memories.
So at that point, he returns to the hotel where he's staying, and he actually hears. Now, this is really interesting because I didn't know that this was a thing. So he hears an SOS on the radio telling him his wife is sick. It
used to be a thing.
Yeah. So apparently, what happens is they list people because obviously she thinks he's in Birmingham on some sort of business trip.
Yeah.
And I think the way he had planned that he was going to lie to her about this trip to Birmingham was that he was going to get a friend to write to her from Birmingham, from the hotel's address.
Yeah, so that she would be convinced.
So that she would think he was at this hotel. But she's always accusing him of cheating, and he talks actually quite a lot in the book about how he has cheated on her till the point where he, as he describes himself, gets fat. Yeah, exactly, and women aren't interested anymore. He still tries it on, even on this trip, but...
With Elsie, don't tell me, let me guess.
No, not with Elsie, with a barmaid or somebody. Anyway, his wife always thinks he's trying it on, which he finds ironic on this time because he's not actually
Yeah.
cheating on her. He's gone for a different purpose. But anyway, so he hears this SOS on the radio saying that his wife is sick, her name, and that he needs to return home immediately. But he thinks she's faking it, so he ignores it.
Yeah.
So yeah, is that a thing? I never knew that was how people would.
It used to be, because if you think about it, there was no other way of letting people know. You hadn't got mobile phones. You hadn't even, people didn't even have phones as a commonplace everywhere. It was getting more common. I mean, even in the 1970s, when my dad was in hospital, my grandparents didn't have a phone, who we were staying with, in an urban area, i.e. where we live now. We had to go to the phone box on the corner to ring up the hospital, and they would ring that number at a certain time to give us the report. So it was quite common that you'd hear, and now the police SOS for such and such.
Goodness, I never even imagined, because when I grew up, everybody just had a
phone, and you just...
Well, we didn't have mobile phones when I was a small child, but we had a telephone in our house,
exactly.
So everybody just rang on the phone. I mean, actually, it seems a really old-fashioned idea now. Even I remember my friends used to ring up the house and say, ask my mum for me, and
you only had one phone line, and usually it was in the hall, and you'd have to sit and freeze if you wanted to talk to your friends.
I still remember this hilarious time because people, would ring the number and, they didn't. And I still remember this time when this old lady rang up our house and she spent my sister picked up the phone and they spent about 15 minutes talking. And it was only when my sister went to get my mum that they realised it was a wrong number, because the lady had rung up and thought it was a granddaughter and my sister had thought it was the grandmother.
Yeah.
And they didn't realise. I think my sister was quite young at the time, and I'm guessing the lady on the phone was a bit...
Maybe she was a little deaf or something, so she...
that was quite funny.
I like that as
you wouldn't have any of that fun nowadays, though, would you?
No.
Because of phones.
Yeah, and then you had party lines when I was really young.
Party lines?
So you shared a phone line with the house next door.
Really?
Which was really exciting, because if you wanted to be nosy, I never did this because it was before my... Of course I didn't. It was before my time. But I can remember my parents saying if you shared the phone line, because phone lines were restricted at one stage, you'd pick up the phone to dial. The other person could be on the phone and you could listen to what they were talking about.
Oh yeah, but we used to have that because we had one phone upstairs in the bedroom and one phone in the living room, so if somebody was on it you could listen in.
Oh, but that's within the same family, not two households.
Yeah, that's
blackmail potential. Not that, in any way immoral or illegal, but...
Yeah, but that was interesting, because that's the thing, actually, just like sometimes I reflect that young people these days, goodness, I sound so old.
People.
No, but they won't ever remember those types of, like even we talk about VHS tapes and setting the video recorder and then realising either you taped over something or the video recorder, the timer didn't work, and you'd get home and you'd be like, no, I missed that episode of something.
And you'd never see it again.
And young people will never have these experiences now because you've got catch-up TV. Anyway, that's me feeling about 95.
Tell me about it.
But yeah, so I thought that was really interesting because I learnt a part of the past that I didn't know that was a thing. So anyway, though, he thinks his wife is faking it, so he just ignores it. And then suddenly he walks out the hotel and he hears a whistle of a bomb. And because of his experience in the First World War, he throws himself on his face when other people don't. And he lays there for ages. Other people get up, but again, because of his experience from World War One, he knows that often one bomb drops, the next one will drop. So he lays there for ages on his face, doesn't get up, and then there isn't another bomb drop. And it actually works out that this is an accident. One of the bomber planes that flies overhead regularly has accidentally dropped a bomb. And he can see like this big house, and he talks quite, again, graphic and grim detail about seeing a house all blown out.
Yeah.
And he can see like a leg just lying there. Yeah, it's quite graphic. It's very gritty, this book, and very grim. It's like if you're feeling like down and you need something to lift you up, not this book.
Don't read it from the sounds of it.
No, don't read it. And if you're feeling down anyway, don't read it.
Yeah.
So at that point he just decides, he's done, he's going to leave town, and he just realises that he can't get the past back and that war is coming. That's kind of when it hits him, and everything that he says, everything that I'm terrified of is coming, whether I like it or not.
Yeah, and I'm powerless to stop it.
Yeah, pretty much that's what he realises, the past is gone and there's just no point even longing after that past. So he decides to return home, but then suddenly as he's returning home, he gets this horrible feeling that maybe his wife is ill. And maybe it wasn't a lie. So he panics and he drives home in a panic, thinking maybe his wife actually is ill, and realising actually maybe he does care for her a bit, because why is he so panicked to the thought she could be ill? But when he gets in, the wife's not there, his children are there, and they say, well, that she's popped out for something, and suddenly she arrives home, and she's like, well, where have you been? Why are you in such panic?
Yeah.
And she has found out that he's not been in Birmingham, but not because of the SOS, because interestingly, he says he only heard her name. And he realises her name must be very common.
Yes,
he didn't listen to any more of the message than the name, so it's his own guilty conscience. Yeah, he only listened to her name, not the address or anywhere where she lived. So she hadn't actually put out an SOS. The reason she'd found out he wasn't in Birmingham was because she had written even before he got to the hotel, and the hotel had closed down 2 years before. They wrote back and said the hotel had closed down, so there was nobody of his name at the hotel. So then when the friend sent the letter from the hotel that had closed down 2 years before, she knew. So they have an argument. And I don't really understand the end of the book. So, because it seems to finish really suddenly. I don't really know what to make of this ending. It just felt like it. So they argue, and she's like accusing him of having an affair, and who's she been with, and whatever. And then he literally just says, he just was the line of least resistance. You see, maybe this is what the book means. And he says, all I wanted was the line of least resistance. And in my mind, I ran over the 3 possibilities, which were A, to tell her what I'd really been doing and somehow make her believe me. B, to pull the old gag about losing my memory. C, to let her go on thinking it was a woman and take my medicine. But damn it, I knew which it would have to be.
And that's interesting, because not having read it, I couldn't guess. I would say, would he insist on the truth all of a sudden?
See, I wonder if the thing about taking the line of least resistance is a kind
Let
of...
her think what she wants to
or
think.
a metaphor for the oncoming invasion of the Nazis.
But then that was very strongly resisted, wasn't it? So,
but in his mind,
he's
mind, almost given into it. I don't know, it's interesting.
That's a very interesting ending.
It's very grim, and like I said, I think what I found even more depressing was that in some ways you could just literally set it 100 years later, and it was like the story would be very, very similar. I found that actually really sad, to be honest. I think that's what hit me more, was that that story, you could just change the settings and change some of the technology in it, and change and it would literally be like so many of the same things would be true, which is really sad, because it just shows that we don't really ever learn anything as a society.
We just repeat our sadnesses, our mistakes, our errors.
But then at the same time, it made me feel quite a connection with that story, because obviously you could put yourself in the character's point of view, even though it was written 100 years ago. I mean, not exactly, of course, not exactly.
But you can see enough parallels that you could empathise with your character.
Yeah, you could definitely empathise with the character. Yeah, I mean, of course, it's not like our life and our existence is nowhere near as grim as that.
Exactly.
But though, as you were saying before with jobs, obviously we're in a privileged position, but for many people actually probably are in a more similar position than that. And for many people, their reality is probably much more aligned with that character. Especially thinking of people who are at war at the moment. So that was interesting. I mean, okay, did I actually like the book? I'd say yes. I was drawn into the book. I really wanted to know what was going to happen.
Reading it, which was...
And George Orwell is an excellent writer. There's no doubting it. I mean, it's not beautiful writing, but it's not meant to be beautiful writing.
No, it's
not
meant to describe
exactly.
Reality,
it describes and it draws you into the setting, and it's well written, and it's it's first person, but you do feel like you're there with that character. I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't say I enjoyed it because it was enjoyable.
It's like an experience.
Exactly, it was an experience reading it, and I think I certainly didn't enjoy it as much 1984. It's interesting though, because you can hear a lot of what the character, at some points he discusses what it would be like if the fascists come. And many of his ideas about what it would be like if the fascists take over are almost then this dystopian idea, similar to a kind of the idea of 1984.
Interesting.
So it's interesting that Orwell obviously already had these ideas about what
going
it would
on
be
in his head
before the war, and he still had those obviously after, when 1949 when he wrote 1984, he obviously still thought that that's what it would have been like had the Nazis taken over. So I would recommend the book for sure. If you're interested, like I said, in history and in a kind of psychological look at what it's like, but certainly it's not a happy read and it's not a jolly read. It's grim and it's gritty. What you feel like with that character is just like, also it's this horrible feeling that for that character you know what's coming next.
Yeah.
You know that all of his worst
yeah.
fears are actually about to come true.
Yeah.
We know that retrospectively now, everything that happened and just how horrific it was.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah. Anyway, so that was a bit of a sad one, but a really interesting book, and I definitely recommend it. That's good. That's
Thank
our
you.
review. Thanks for watching,
Hope you've
and
liked it.
see you next time.
Yeah, bye bye for now.
Bye bye.